years rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us tonight one of my colleagues, Dr. Waldo Floyd.
Great to be here, Joe
Waldo.
Sam.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. And tonight we're going to journey into the history of medicine and have some discussions along those lines. I think you have an interest in Dr. Halsted, do you not?
Well, I do. William Stewart Halsted. He, the father of American surgery, and a seminal anyone who's ever had an operation.
Yes.
In contemporary America, the principles on which that surgery was done were developed by Halsted.
Well, that's a pretty interesting name, Halsted. When did he walk the earth, Waldo? When was
he was born in 1852.
Yes.
And he died, I think, around 1924, 25.
And so during that period, he was responsible for many of the innovations that make surgery the relatively safe, not totally safe, but at least safer than it would have been otherwise. Is that right?
You know, in Halsted, in the 1880s, when Halsted became a young surgeon,
yes,
and he went to Europe for his training.
Did
but
he?
In America, there were less than 20 full-time surgeons in this country who just practiced, who were medical doctors,
yes,
who just practiced surgery.
Yes. Well,
and most of what they did was drain abscesses and amputate your leg or arm.
Now, we've had some advances in surgery during the 19th century, and we maybe could talk about Lord Lister, but starting out with Crawford Long, and
Sure.
and I think there's a debate about whether the first anesthesia occurred in rural Georgia at Crawford Long, and I think Jefferson, Georgia, or in the Ether Dome at Massachusetts General Hospital.
Well,
can you opine on that?
Well, you know, I spent a few years working. I was a chief resident at Massachusetts General Hospital, and I'll
Yes.
tell you, in the Ether Dome, which
Yes.
is a building where the first public demonstration of
Yes.
ether was done, there's a surgical gallery, like you see in pictures
Yes.
of all these chairs looking down
Yes,
on where the
yes.
surgeon did the surgery. And the people those who were present at the first public demonstration, I believe it was Dr. Warren who did the surgery.
Right.
And they have little brass labels on the table. This is not talked about much, but on the first row is a brass plaque, and it says Crawford W. Long, M.D.
Well, I'm shocked. Wait a second. I don't believe that.
Yes,
Is that,
sir.
You mean it's all right? This
You
right
can
on
go to
television.
Boston and see
Oh,
it.
I can't believe that. I'm shocked.
No
I'm
one talks
floored.
about it. And,
I don't believe it.
And I don't know
Start
the
with.
significance beyond the point that right there on the first row of the Ether Dome, in brass, is emblazoned Crawford W. Long.
Now,
MD.
for the audience, I mean, just say, cut to the chase on this historical point, is many people in Georgia claim that Dr. Crawford Long was the first person to use anesthesia, and there's a debate about where the credit is given. And these events took place in the 1840s. I believe the Ether Dome was 1846. Mm-hmm. And Crawford Long had been conducting experiments at an earlier date, and so the question is who gets the credit? And I will say, as a patriotic citizen of Georgia, and having been born in Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta, there's a big claim that he might have been the person that did it. In fact, in the United States Capitol, each of the states are entitled to put statues of
the United States Capitol.
That's right, United States Capitol, and the Georgia has elected to put Crawford Long statue in there as the real, I guess, father of.
I mean, I think he is. It's just that as you know, he was working on the frontier. And those guys were up there in the
Well,
Mecca.
that's sort of a point about innovation, isn't it? I mean, if a person makes an innovation and never publishes it or talks about it, I mean, is that really an innovation? And so the events that took place in Boston in 1846, that was well publicized, and even though the Crawford Long might have had the idea a bit sooner, the credit really has been seized by those, I guess, those people at Harvard, but that seems to be what occurred.
Well, you know how they are.
Well, I know exactly. But just to keep talking about the issue, as do you, Waldo, but just to continue on the subject, so we had in the 19th century, ether had come along, and Lord Lister had been doing some of his work. Is that correct? Before,
That's right.
Joseph the 1870s,
Joseph
late
Lister he's a Scot, and he was at University of Edinburgh. He was at University of Glasgow, and he basically developed principles that of antiseptic surgery.
Yes.
And basically his principle was wounds should be washed out with caustic substances like phenol or carbolic acid.
Right.
And killed the way my grandmother would put methylate on my wounds.
Yes.
As opposed to Halsted would later take it a step forward and avoid the introduction of bacteria. But Halsted was a young surgeon in New York, and at that time, few surgeons in America, or in the world for that matter, felt that the germ theory was viable. And Lister proposed basic principles that bacteria caused infections, and that frequently they were introduced by surgeons.
That's right. Yes.
And but Halsted heard him speak around 1886.
Yes.
When he was working at Bellevue. But Halsted had grown up in New York. He was a son of privilege. Grew up on the east side of New York City. He attended Phillips Andover Academy.
Yes.
And then he was a poor student there. Took him 6 years to get through Andover, and then his dad had him stay at home in New York for a year and being tutored privately for the entrance examinations at Yale. Then he attended Yale and was a poor student at Yale, but he was captain of the football team there. The first team, he scored a winning touchdown on the first team ever to field 11 men.
Well, that's a rather, if one may digress slightly on that subject, I mean, there's more to life than, if one could say this, rote memorization, and actually physicality is an important part of success in life, isn't it? You have to be able, and along with that, physical courage.
Sure.
So, and Halsted had those in abundance.
He had those in abundance. And he also had a bit of a rebel streak. He had gone to a junior boarding school up in Massachusetts before he went to Andover and ran away from there and took the train home. And his father was a successful businessman. His grandfather had basically owned and developed what's now Chicago.
Yes.
And, they were like some British lord who owned land in India, developing Chicago.
He owned Chicago, including, I think, Halsted Avenue there is a really...
It's the longest street in Chicago.
And I think if any of our, viewers pass through Chicago and you're around, you'll certainly see Halsted.
And that's named after his great-grandfather.
Wow.
But then Halsted, when he was a senior at Yale, picked up a book by Dr. Dalton, who was in New York, a physiology book, and became very, it took to him. He paid attention to it. And we'll talk about this later. Halsted may have had what people today would call ADD.
Really? Yes.
And then he also read Gray's Anatomy.
Yes.
And he said, wow, I like this, and he went to medical school.
Yes.
In medical school, he was first in his class at what was then the Physicians and Surgeons, which later became part of Columbia University.
Yes. So he really flowered, and he became interested in surgery, and he was a very productive person.
He went to Bellevue Hospital for a year in New York, where he was an intern, which was a choice position. And while he was there, he developed charting of colored charts, red for temperature, black for pulse, hours. We until electronic medical records we still use.
Yes.
And then he decided he really wanted to be a surgeon, but that the only place to learn surgery, and in his estimation, the only place to really learn medicine at that time was from the Austrians and Germans.
Well, now that's an interesting comment because I can recollect that my father, who was a physician, learned German just with the idea that would be useful for him in his studies.
Well,
and I mean, that used to be the language. I mean,
oh, and my father applied to medical school at Johns Hopkins, where Halstead ultimately ended up.
Yes.
You were not admitted unless you had a reading knowledge of German.
Yes. Well, and German can be a very taxing language, can it not?
Well,
I mean,
it can,
those verbs, those
but, you know, I
subjects.
had a professor who was also Hopkins trained, but 60 years older than, 50 years older than I.
Yes.
And God bless him, Dr. Littler's passed on, but he always said that if you think you've invented a new operation,
Yes.
you just haven't read the 19th century German literature.
Yes. Well, the Germans were very productive. We could talk slightly about that. I mean, the German culture is really extraordinary. Their science was unbelievable. This was the time of the unification. That they won the Franco-Prussian War. The German Empire was triumphant. The whole and their science was racing ahead. Their standard of living. They, in many ways, were the path of the future until they were terribly misled.
Right.
But one of the things about this is, I think, with the German medicine, German science, is the idea of the professor, the dominant figure from which wisdom flows, if one can say it that way.
Well, and Halstead became enamored and spent time with several professors. He spent 2 years there.
Yes.
As a young man, as a 25 or 26-year-old.
Yes.
And he spent a year with a gentleman named Bill Roth.
Aha.
And
a rather famous name.
Bill Roth basically developed abdominal surgery there, and he was in Vienna, and he was best friends with Johannes Brahms.
Oh, really?
Who wrote the lullabies.
Wow.
And Bill Roth was a violinist himself.
Yes.
Bill Roth also believed that if you were going to be a surgeon,
Yes.
it took 10 years after medical school minimum.
So one of the things we're hearing here is a lot of things. Firstly, expert validation, authoritarian devotion to your trade, no 80-hour work weeks, no distraction, no family distractions, just total.
And really no concern about money.
That's
These
right.
guys really didn't care about making money. They loved what they did.
And it was sort of a samurai spirit, the same way the samurai would be disdainful of it. You're totally committed to.
They did not believe one should become married until you finish your surgical training.
Yes.
And your surgical training took 10 years at a minimum.
Yes.
After medical school.
Yes.
So you were 35 when you finished.
Yes, that was the ideal, and then you would be able to, having obtained this wisdom through your own work, suffering, efforts, then you could help people, and so that was a very noble kind of thing, and Halstead imbibed those notions.
And he learned from Bill Roth. He learned pathology from von Recklinghausen.
Yes.
And Virchow.
Yes.
And Chiari.
Wow.
I mean, neurology from. He learned, I mean, he trained with these people who now. De Quervain, it's a wrist disorder I treat every day, was named after one of the guys that Halstead spent time with.
Now, Waldo, in doing this, did he depend on financial support
His
from
father
his
supported him.
Now that's an issue, isn't it? If you had been a poor, bright boy in 19th century America and you'd wanted to pursue this, it would have been impossible.
Absolutely impossible.
So only a few people with wealth would have undertaken this, and he used the money that his family had in a very wise way, and his family contributed in a wise way.
His family supported him totally.
Yes.
And there's even been some historical facts that have come to light that his father may have even embezzled money to send Halstead to Europe.
Well, that makes the story slightly less noble.
Slightly less noble, but somewhat real. But
well, that's humans in action. Yes.
But Halstead had this education and this desire to educate.
Yes.
And it's interesting, while he was there in Vienna, one of the other young people studying neurology and psychology at the same time was Sigmund Freud.
Is that right? Wow.
They were, they were both.
Did their paths cross?
We're not sure. We know that they had a mutual friend named Kohler.
Yes.
And that's interesting because Halstead returned to New York.
Yes.
And was, without question, the top surgeon in the United States.
Yes.
He was vigorous. He was energetic. He also took $10,000 of his family money because he did not believe the operating rooms at Bellevue Hospital in New York were sufficiently sanitary, and built a tent
Well, so that's a lot of money.
$10,000.
That's a lot of money.
About
How does that-
1885.
What is that, $1 million or
86.
some number like that?
Right.
It's a big number that he just was able to use.
And he said to the hospital, if you won't build it for me, I'll build it myself.
And then so he opened practice, and did he attract a large clientele that many people?
He attracted clientele from, well, he worked in 5 hospitals. He attracted clientele from all over New York and its environs. And he was a young man at this time.
Right.
I mean, he was 30, 31,
Yes,
32,
yes,
33. He was single. He loved the arts.
Yes.
He lived on the east side of New York, 2 doors down
Yes.
from where Thomas Edison had first electrified a house in the
Oh,
United
really?
States.
Wow.
So these were exciting times.
Sure.
And he learned that the man Kohler, Dr. Kohler
Yes.
in Vienna,
Right.
gave a paper, and this was a bit of a turning point that would plague Halsted the rest of his life.
Yes.
Kohler gave a paper in Germany, in Frankfurt, on anesthetizing the eye with topical cocaine, a new
Yes,
drug,
yes.
limited.
Right.
They're putting it in with soda water in Atlanta, but in Germany they're putting it in
I
your
think
eye.
you're making a little joke about a great beverage we've all imbibed.
Sure,
as,
absolutely.
Coca-Cola.
Absolutely.
I hope no one puts us in prison.
No,
for
I'm
saying
all for
this.
Coca-Cola. I went to Emory University. I
Right,
think
right.
it's great.
Well, I
but-
think I've had it my share too. But
but they were using it to do surgery on the eye, to anesthetize the eye.
Right.
And Halsted and Kohler. The interesting thing is, Freud had been doing the first work
Yes.
with cocaine,
Right. Yes.
treating depression. Freud became addicted himself. Freud
Yes.
later apparently beat his addiction,
Yes.
but with great effort.
Difficult. Yes. very
Great difficulty.
Yes.
But Kohler, Freud was upset
Yes.
from then on because he knew it was a local anesthetic. He had not taken it. He knew it made people numb, but he
Right.
didn't know that it could be used therapeutically. He did not develop that.
Right.
Kohler did for the eye. And then Halsted, in New York at this time, said, well, if it will make your eye numb,
Yes.
will it make other nerves numb?
Right. Yes.
And experimented on himself
Yes.
and 6 other medical students, 1 other colleague. 5 of them died
Really.
from cocaine-related deaths.
Wow. So this is like kind of the sorcerer's apprentice. I mean, you're a person, you sort of have this extraordinary substance. I wonder what it can do, and it turns out it can destroy you.
Exactly.
And they were unaware of this.
They were
So-
unaware of that. They were doing their surgery with cocaine
yes,
anesthesia,
yes.
but they learned there are various nerves that go to the
Right,
hand
yes.
or the foot or to the mouth and eye.
Right.
And they learned not only can you inject your skin and
Right.
numb it, but just like you can with a spinal anesthetic
Right,
or
right.
axillary block, you could put that medicine around a nerve and block everything beyond it, which was a major innovation.
Of course, we had a little en passant conversation about the ether dome and that controversy, but I think the general public can understand if you could do a local anesthesia on your periphery and avoid the risk of general anesthesia.
Or have a tooth pill.
Sure, it's a tremendously great thing that's a great advance. And then Halsted was attempting to pioneer that advance, and then he had
Absolutely.
this terrible, terrible nip that occurred.
He didn't realize going in that this is one of the most addictive substances there
yes,
is.
yes,
And you read about people putting it up their nose
Right,
or
right.
whatever. Halsted was injecting it into himself with a needle. He was, and using a lot of cocaine
Right.
and became severely addicted. And there is some evidence that individuals with ADD
Right.
may be more prone to cocaine addiction.
yes.
And his life up to that point suggested and later suggested he
Right,
may
yes,
have had that
yes.
condition. He went into the operating room one day, decided he couldn't do it, stormed out, and locked himself in his room for 7 months.
Yes. And what happened in those 7 months? Was he taking cocaine, or
Everyone believes he was taking an extraordinary amount of cocaine.
yes,
But he had a friend, and his friend was named William Henry Welch.
a rather famous name.
Right. basically, some would say the father of public health, one of the fathers of modern pathology, and later the first dean of Johns Hopkins Medical School.
Did their friendship occur in New York, or was this in Baltimore?
They were at Yale, and they were at Columbia. They were at Physicians and Surgeons
so
together.
they just
and
passed through their training
together at Bellevue.
They were lifelong friends.
Lifelong friends.
Yes.
And Welch knew that Halstead's talents as a surgeon were extraordinary.
Yes, yes.
The other thing I left out, when Halstead came back to New York,
Yes.
he did several things. One, his sister was dying after childbirth.
Yes.
And he had the presence of mind. She was bleeding. And several doctors were in attendance. She was on her deathbed. Halstead comes in and says, "My sister can't die," got a syringe, withdrew his own blood,
Yes.
and gave the first transfusion in the United States to his sister and saved her life.
Wow, wow.
And within that same year or 18-month period, his mother had traveled to Albany, New York.
Yes.
And there she developed an infected gallbladder.
Yes.
And Halstead knew about it. They contacted him probably by the telegram or
Yes,
something.
yes.
He took a train to New York, to Albany from New York City, arrived after midnight on the kitchen table, diagnosed her with acute cholecystitis.
Yes, yes.
And on the kitchen table at 2 a.m. did what may be the first cholecystectomy or draining.
Yes, right, yes.
And so all of this was going on during the time, or perhaps coincident or shortly before he became this severely impaired cocaine addict.
Yeah. Being impaired, he still wound up at Johns Hopkins.
Well, there's a story to that. He first Welch knew of Halstead's potential
Yes.
and what he was doing, and Welch had been contacted. There was this Quaker merchant in Baltimore
Yes.
who was quite wealthy, who basically founded a university and founded a university and a hospital based on the German model of education.
Yes.
And had contacted Welch, who would become the dean.
Yes.
Well, Welch had plans for Halstead, and in order to get him off of cocaine,
Yes.
put him on a schooner to the
Yes.
West Indies.
Yes.
And with a limited amount of cocaine, they try to ration it, and all kinds of stories. Halstead, after he ran out, broke into the ship's cabinet. Halstead, they say, from some doctor in Granada or something, got some. But anyway, after it became clear after they returned to New York that wasn't enough. So they
Yes.
put him in a sanatorium.
Yes.
Welch and Halstead's father had him committed to Butler Sanatorium in Providence,
Yes,
Rhode Island,
yes.
under the name William Stewart, his middle name.
Yes. Yes.
And the way they treated his cocaine addiction, they got him off cocaine by giving him morphine.
Morphine, is that right? So out of the frying pan into the fire, or whatever, equally a demon.
And right. And then after he'd been there for 6 or 9 months, Welch says, "I'm down at Hopkins, come down here. You can't see patients,
Yes.
but you can work in the lab."
Yes.
And he started doing dog surgery, and basically during that period, he they say his surgical style changed. He became very slow. He became very methodical. And I saw this in my training. It was a bit like neurosurgery, like
Yeah.
brain surgery.
Yes.
Every vessel was
Right.
tied off. Surgery took a long time. There was good anesthesia.
Right.
But he was operating on dogs.
Yes.
And he learned, he determined how to sew the intestines together and have
Yes.
it whole.
Yes.
Went up and gave the talk at Harvard Medical School. Developed significant renown after that, but even subsequent to that, went back to the sanatorium
Yes.
for a while longer. And then Sir William Osler,
Yes.
maybe other than Hippocrates and St. Luke, the most famous
right.
physician
Yes.
of all
Yeah,
time.
Yes.
So William Osler had come in as the chief of internal medicine at
Yes.
Hopkins. Welch was there. They needed a surgeon. And they both convinced the Board of Trustees that Halstead was what we would say today clean and to hire him.
Although that was not the case.
That was not the case. And the interesting thing is Osler wrote all of these things, wrote a diary of these
Yes.
days, and wrote about what Halstead was doing in these years. and sealed it for to be sealed for 100 years.
Oh, is that right?
In his own
Yeah.
in his own hand, in a diary with a silver locking key.
Oh,
Apparently.
really? Well,
But after all the principals had died, in I think 1969 they opened
Yes.
it, and Osler and Welch both knew that he had never totally gotten off of morphine and cocaine.
and then he was allowed to see patients at this world eminent institution. And
He made it a world eminent institution.
He contributed to it, Waldo.
Right, he contributed.
He was a very successful person. And
But I think he did contribute to it, and it became, like many hospitals, surgery kept the hospital afloat.
yes, yes,
And there was one professor of surgery.
and that was Halstead.
That was Halstead, and everyone else, every other surgeon there was his resident.
Now, one of the things we hear these stories about, in American healthcare system is undergoing this enormous revolution, and there's a lot of, I guess, desire to change the authoritarian structure of it. But that's sort of the archetypical kind of, I guess, system. We have a very, very strong professor. He demands the best of his pupils. He subjects them to great rigor. They make a moral commitment, and then they're printed with a picture of the professor on their souls, I guess you'd say. And then off they go to do good work. And the contribution of Halstead to American surgery and what his residents performed, I mean, they really, you could say that was the start of everything.
Well, you know, it was the start of everything. You know, Halstead would have one resident, picking Harvey Cushing.
Which the two, that's an interesting story too. There was a little tension between them. And
Well, you know, Harvey Cushing, as you know, was the first neurosurgeon.
well,
perhaps.
I don't know if I could say that, but he was certainly the archetypical domineering figure in neurosurgery, and he's really, you'd call him the grandfather
Right.
of neurosurgery.
And
Yes.
then basically Halstead had this technique of surgery,
Yes.
which meant you respect the anatomy. You do not introduce bacteria. Of course, Halstead developed surgical gloves
Yes.
to protect his future wife's hands from the antiseptic solution.
Now, Waldo, we're drawing near to the end of our time, but
Oh, come
maybe
on,
you
we need
could
another 30 minutes.
Well, I maybe have to put you on some more. But the takeaway message with his wife, what happened there, and then I'll ask you to talk briefly about his romantic ventures, and then maybe how he left the earth.
Okay. Well, Halstead's wife was a Southerner from one of the greatest Southern families.
Yes.
Her uncle was Wade Hampton, who was a planner, a Confederate general, later governor, and I believe senator from South Carolina. They owned a lot of property in North Carolina. They also owned where the Greenbrier is
Yes.
up in West Virginia.
Yes.
And it was, and she, though, the family was destitute after the war.
Yes.
Sherman had burned their home.
Yes,
And
he tended to do that. I think.
and she went. The family run out of money. She goes to New York to become a nurse.
Yes.
Becomes Halstead's nurse. Halstead, when he goes from New York to Baltimore, insists on bringing her along.
Yes.
And what was, I'm sure, for many years a professional relationship became a loving relationship.
Yes.
Halstead would use Listerian, Joseph Lister's techniques of carbolic acid and various other antiseptics to
Yes.
clean your hands before surgery. And she was getting a rash. So he had the Goodyear Rubber Company
Yes.
make these gloves for her. And, you know, when they were married, it was felt that this was a dominant, what we would call Yankee family, a
Right.
dominant Southern family,
Right.
and they got together. They were married in Columbia, South Carolina. They had a home in Cashiers, North Carolina.
Yes.
Y'all can take a
Right,
3 or 4
yes.
hour trip and
Right,
see
go
their home
see it,
now.
yes.
And they were, but they had a difficult relationship because really there's some evidence that Carolyn Hampton Halstead may have been a morphine addict herself.
Wow.
And Halstead was certainly a high-functioning cocaine and morphine addict, and they never had any children. Halstead died of biliary colic, and he first had one of his residents. He went to Baltimore and had one of his residents operate on him, and he did well for 9 months. And then it came back, and he took the train to Baltimore from Cashiers, North Carolina, and sent for his other resident who was then professor at Cincinnati to come to Baltimore and operate on him. He didn't survive.
Well, on that note, Waldo, I think we're going to have to conclude our chat. However, we're going to have you back for another longer interchange on a person who's a great figure in American healthcare.
It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for
Yes, sir.
coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.